Delano Area Council for Arts and Culture, and we are sponsoring the Spirit of Community Trail along with other organizations that are doing it, mainly the city. But I want to introduce Wendy Gilmer to explain a little bit what this trail is and how the donation will go towards it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. This trail has been a project of working together with a variety of organizations in town, the Historic Society, the Arts Council, the city, the chamber, local businesses. So it's been great to put it together. The whole idea is the spirit of community. And how do we get our spirit of community? We look at how our past kind of influenced our current situation and how we are. Because a lot of people come to Delano and they think, wow, this is a tight-knit community, and how do you get like that? Well, it's a history of entrepreneurship, creativity, resilience, investment, just civic organizations. So that's what, when we look through the history, that's the idea of what to pull out. And whether it's your family or somebody else's family or neighbors of yours that have connections, it just kind of reminds us that we're all have these connections, whether it's, like I said, whether it's directly yours or it's just how we are related together and what brings us together and finds us in a common place that we want to learn more about. So the idea of the trail, it started almost a year and a half ago now, and there are currently 16 sites on the trail. That's what this handout is for you today. It's just an informational guide about it. And so in 16 locations around town, you can find one of these plaques and also a medallion in the sidewalk. And it is this is life size. And this is a map to show you where it is and a description of it. You use your smartphone to click on the QR code, and you can even do that tonight at some point or wherever. And it gives you the history of the site. And actually, these sites then tie into some of the exhibits in the Heritage Center. So we're trying to make it kind of an interactive experience with the history trail, with the Spirit of Community Trail, along with the History Center. So please take some time to try to figure out how to use these QR codes, and then it makes it that much more exciting when you're right in front of the building, and then you can see what the history is with that. So going forward, we will be putting another 20 sites in. We are really hoping for the end of this year. We've had some, I'm just going to call it COVID delays, supply chain issues, that type of stuff. And we're trying to make sure it lasts as long as we can. And so one of the things we're doing is we're upgrading the website that we've been using. We're creating a special website for that. So we're doing that. And also we're trying to keep that going in annually. So the funds for tonight, for example, will be used to pay for us to upgrade that website that we use, because we used to have a free one, and so we're going to make it a little more, we're hoping that the whole project lasts longer and the content on there will be able to adjust with technology. So that's a lot of what we're using it for. And then any other signage that comes up that we're not able to get funding through the city and through the civic organizations. So we really appreciate your support for that. And we're hoping to tie this in then with the 150th of Delano. So believe it or not, that's coming up in 2026. So thank you very much.
So I don't know about you, but when we moved to Delano, I wondered how the name came about. And I heard that it was this F.R. Delano, and I was like, that's good. But I couldn't find out what he did. I heard various stories that he was a conductor on the train, that he was the superintendent of the train, that he actually lived in Boston and just directed immigrants to this area to work and live in Delano. And it wasn't until we met Tom Delano that he was able to clarify what the history actually was. So this evening we're going to have Tom speak with Charles Ash and Dean Hoyer, sorry, doing some musical interludes throughout the speech. So Tom Delano was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, 5th generation Minnesotan. So that debunks the living in Boston, although he does now. He He taught in at Bloomington Jefferson, became a educational book publisher, and that took him to Boston. And he did that for 40 years. He's married to his lovely wife, Chris, who is here today, who's fifth generation from St. Paul. They have 2 children, so the Delano legacy lives on. Tom.
Thank you, Debbie. Well, welcome to Discovering F.R. Delano, or Francis Roach Delano. And I really should have called it F.R. Delano, the man, the myth, and the legend, because I'm going to cover kind of all of those things. There's a lot of facts here. There's a lot of family myth and family legend, and I'll try to identify which is which. But it should be interesting. Hopefully it'll be entertaining. Hopefully it'll also be informative and even educational by the time we get through this. One of the things I'm so excited about is it's great to come to a location, a city, where they pronounce your name the way you pronounce your name. And I say that only because a lot of parts of the country, that's not this way. For example, if you look on the sides here, there are many, many, many different spellings and pronunciations of Delano. It gets frustrating. I get tired of correcting people after a while, but you just say, hey, live with it, deal with it. But the 2 main pronunciations are Delano and Delano. And we have a family organization, and we're always trying to be very correct and say Delano Delano or Delano Delano so we don't offend anybody. But there's been various spellings over the last 400 years, as you can see. So it's great to at least come and not have to correct people. All right, so let me get going here. I've got it broken up into several parts, as you can see, and we'll have some music interludes in between. But I want to start out first and foremost with F.R.'s, Delano's influence.
I think it's for the people in the back, they can see it a little bit.
Oh, all right. Yep. I want to start out with F.R. Delano's Delano family influence. This month is a very special month for Delano's in the sense that it's the 400th anniversary of the first Delano coming to New England, or Plymouth Colony. It's actually 19th of November. And so there have been Delanos here for 400 years. There were Delanos here 200 years before F.R. was ever born in Massachusetts. And the reason I mention that is he knew all of this stuff. He knew his family genealogy. He knew a lot of the first comers that were in this country since 1620, and that, I think, had an influence on him. The first Delano that came, and I mention this because I think it plays a pretty important role, is Philip Delano, or as they say, Philippe de Lanois. That's how it's pronounced, Philippe de Lanois. But it quickly became anglicized to Philip Delano, and he is the person that basically started the family. All of us descend from Philip Delano, and he came in 1621 on the ship the Fortune. What's interesting is he did very, very well as a farmer and as a fisherman, and he got an acre of land and very quickly became what was known as a purchaser in Mayflower terms. And a purchaser means that they retired the debt of the people that underwrote the Pilgrims. And this gave him first choice on all new land grants. So very quickly in 1627, he got a land grant of 40 acres in the town Chris and I presently live in called Duxbury. So Duxbury is a Delano town, just like Delano is. And it's kind of fun to walk around there and you tell people their name and they say, oh my gosh. But anyway, he was one of the original founders. Very quickly, he had 11 children. Now, one thing you'll notice with all the Delanos is they all had big families, most of them. And they all lost infants, usually, and not all of them survived to adulthood. But he gave his son, Lieutenant Jonathan Delano, 800 acres in what was then called Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And Jonathan moved there in the 1660s. the FR's ancestors remained in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and Dartmouth then broke up into little parts. New Bedford is part of it, Dartmouth, Fairhaven, Acushnet, Westport. It broke up, but the family was there for about 100 years, and then FR's grandfather moved the family out to an incredibly small town in central Massachusetts called New Braintree, and to basically set up a farm. FR's grandfather was a sea captain, and he was both a whaler and a merchantman. And whaling, if you know anything about whaling, is an incredibly dirty, nasty business. And I just really feel that he didn't want his son, Gideon, involved in that at all. So he moved the family out there, raised them out there. He went back and forth to New Bedford and New Braintree to do ship captaining, and the family and his son Gideon stayed in New Braintree. And that brings us to FR's father. I found this in a trunk where I found a lot of this stuff. About 3 years ago in my mother's condo in South Minneapolis, there's a trunk up in the attic. And I started going through it, sort of kind of getting an idea of what's in it so I could figure out, when the day comes, my mother's 96. When the day comes, I at least have an idea of what's in this trunk. I came across this picture of, this would be my great-great-great-grandfather, three greats, great-great-great-grandfather. It was taken in about the 1830s. Photography was relatively new then, so it's incredibly rare. But this is FR's father. FR had two wives, Gideon had two wives. His first wife, not uncommon, it's a sort of a common Delano thing too. His first wife died relatively young, but after having 5 children. Gideon remarried then, and basically started out and had another 5 children, or 6 children, I guess. You'll find that the family is tied in with American history very, very closely. I mentioned, obviously, Philip Delano coming and spending a lot of time with the Pilgrims. Captain Abisha Delano was in the Revolution. He was a member of the Committee for Correspondence and Safety, and those committees ran in New England. When the English rule broke down during the Revolution, they needed some sort of government, and the committees of correspondence ran those things. So FR's grandfather was involved in that. And Gideon himself was an incredibly patriotic guy. His first wife, Nancy Howe Delano, her father was Artemus Howe, and he actually commanded a company at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It actually was in Concord. And that's pretty significant. But more importantly, he just was imbued with the whole American spirit of this new country that was born out of revolution and created in liberty. And he was very much into it. So much so that a lot of you know the Battle of Bunker Hill. Anybody been to Boston here lately? Okay, good. You'll recognize this, the Bunker Hill Monument. Big battle during the Revolution, of course, as you all know. I don't know if you can really see that, but I have a certificate that Gideon donated money, it's in his name, to the building of that monument. And some of the names on here are quite interesting. Daniel Webster, Edward Everett. I mean, some of the old Boston patriotic or patriots and leaders in the Boston area had signed this thing, which is kind of cool. So a question I'm sure a lot of you have asked and you've known about is FR Delano related to FDR, the president? And the answer is yes. And I was at Hyde Park a couple of years ago, sat down and talked with FDR and asked him. And a bit trifle one-sided, as you might imagine. But FDR is FR's second cousin, twice removed. FDR's grandfather was Warren Delano II. If you read any FDR biographies, his name is always prominent. He built the family fortune. And he and FR were second cousins. And then FR's grandfather, Captain Abisha Delano, and FDR's great-great-grandfather, Captain Ephraim Delano, were both sea captains. They were brothers, and they both were involved in the Revolution. So that's kind of cool. And what's interesting is, if you know FDR's history, Warren Delano II went to China and made several fortunes and lost a couple while he was there. And FR Delano came to Minnesota, and he made at least one fortune, maybe two. And that was what he did. But that was sort of the way the family, operated back then. And if you genealogists in the crowd, this is the actual genealogy, and you can see the connection is made between the two, with FDR down here and then Francis Roach Delano up there. And there's my grandfather right there. So those of you that are curious, it makes me fourth cousin to FDR, twice removed, of course. So let me take a break here and let these gentlemen.
This is My Home, a New England or Nova Scotian style fiddle tune to kind of represent the New England influence on the founding of Delano.
All right, let's get to FR's birth. November 1823, and I mentioned he was born in a very, very small town, and the town looks almost exactly the way it looked 200 years ago in central Massachusetts. It's just a widening of the road. In fact, as they say, you can't get there from here, although they say that in Maine, but you could say it in central Massachusetts. And you'll notice on this first bullet, his name is Francis Roach Delano, and he changed the spelling of his middle name as time went on. He was the last son of Gideon and Betsy Brimhall Delano. Betsy was from Hingham, Massachusetts. Somehow she found her way out into central Massachusetts. Hingham's on the coast. But she and Gideon married in 1808, and they lived together for the next 45 years or so. Anyway, the interesting thing that I found was FR, because his father was a patriot, FR was named after Francis Roach. And if you know your Revolutionary War history, you might remember the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. Well, the owner and the captain of the ship Dartmouth, which was one of the 3 ships in the Boston Tea Party, was owned by the Roach family, and it was piloted or captained by Francis Roach. And he tipped off the Patriots that they were coming up the deadline, they weren't going to pay the tea tax, and we need some help. And that's when a group of patriots, I guess you could call them, dressed up as Mohawk Indians and got on board and threw the tea over in the Boston Harbor. Now, obviously the Roach family were ship owners in the New Bedford area at that point, and I think Captain Bishop, FR's grandfather, probably captained for the family at some point, so they knew each other. But what's interesting, and again, a family myth, it's reported that some of the tea from the Boston Tea Party got as far as at least FR's generation. I've looked for it. I have not seen it, but it's there somewhere, and if I come across it, I will gladly donate it to the town of Delano. Anyway, so FR had an older brother who was named John Adams. He had another one that was Charles Adams. Gideon named a lot of the kids after some of the patriots. Anyway, FR spent his first 10 years of life there, and then in about 1833, since he was the youngest, some of his older brothers were ready to go on to secondary school. Gideon and Betsy moved the family to Amherst, Massachusetts, which was due west of New Braintree by about another 35 or 40 miles. And the reason was because Amherst had some pretty good schools at that point. There were really no schools beyond the primary grades in New Braintree. So FR ended up doing his secondary school work at Amherst Academy, which is still a well-known school. Amherst College sprung from Amherst Academy. Amherst Academy was founded by Noah Webster, who we all probably have heard of. And it quickly became one of the premier private schools in New England. The mission, as I have there, is to teach morality, piety, and religion. And also, the curriculum was broad and ambitious. Needless to say, FR and his older brothers got a very, very rigorous, very, very extensive secondary school education. Not many people went to college then, so if you had gone through that kind of an education, you were in pretty good shape. And he graduated in 1839 and from Dartmouth, or from Amherst Academy. And while he was in school, he started working at a local machine shop and realized he had an aptitude for working with machinery and tools. So even though he graduated in English and had a very, very broad, very liberal education, he was drawn to technology or to engineering. And so what he did was he either went to work for or joined, I'm not sure which, the Army Corps of Engineers. And engineering schools really didn't exist back then, but the Army, basically, because of West Point, had a pretty good group of people that would manage the Army's engineering projects, whether it was building fortresses or working on rivers, waterways, that sort of thing. So he went to work for 2 years for the Corps of Engineers. And then he went to work for the Boston and Worcester Railroad as an engineer and a fireman. So he developed a lot of the basic skills that he needed when he came out to Minnesota through his study at Amherst Academy, his time at the Corps of Engineers, and then obviously working on a railroad as an engineer. While he was doing that, his parents, and I'm never sure why this happened, but his mother, father, and 2 older brothers moved to southern Illinois, directly near St. Louis. And you know, maybe it was, you know, Manifest Destiny, Go West, Young Man, I don't know what, but it was, you know, a big jump to take from Massachusetts out to the middle of the United States. So FR joined him there in 1844, which happened to be the year that his father Gideon died. But he came out there and set up shop. So now the next question is, who is Charles Delano? And you probably haven't heard of him, but he's fairly well known in Western Massachusetts. He's FR's older brother. He's 3 years older than FR. He did not go to Southern Illinois, or Bunker Hill, Illinois. Stayed in Amherst, went to Amherst College, became a lawyer, and a very successful lawyer. Interestingly enough, he became a Republican in the mid-1850s when the Republican Party was formed, and he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1858. I've not come across any correspondence between FR and his brother, but they had a lot of similar interests and they were not that far apart in age. So I'm guessing they did correspond. Charles was on the Military Affairs, which was called Arms and Arsenals Committee in the Congress back then, and also the District of Columbia Committee. What makes him interesting, however, is at the beginning of the Civil War, and those of you that have watched or read Civil War books, there was the First Battle of Bull Run or the First Battle of Manassas, whichever you like. A great number of Washington civilians, famous people, Congress people, whatever, all rode their carriages out, had a picnic to watch this battle. And it started out great. The Union was being very successful, except Stonewall Jackson got involved, and he held the line and then pushed the Union line and broke the Union line. And all of a sudden, these picnickers were sitting there, and there was just a huge number of Union soldiers running back. And then they said, wait a minute, we're winning. Where are you going? And they said, no, get out of here, quick, quick. And so all of them beat a hasty retreat back to Washington, D.C., Charles being one of them, of course. And he later became a prominent railroad lawyer, which I think had a little bit of a connection between what some of FR did, too, later on. Okay, the other thing that was a big for FR in Bunker Hill, and that is he met his wife Callista Ann Cavender. And that's Callista in 1845 or 46. She would have been 20 years old, but that was his wife. And I fell in love. They got married. It's kind of nice. I've had some of his books, and I've gone through them. And he used to give her books as gifts, you know, serious works of literature. And he would write very, very nice things in there about how much he loved her. I thought that was pretty cool. Callista's family is kind of interesting, too. I won't go too far off track here, but her grandfather is Charles Cavender. And Charles Cavender came from Wexford, County Wexford, Ireland. And he was fishing one day off the coast, and a British privateer came by, captured him, and impressed him into the British Navy, which is what they did a lot then. They need sailors, you know, hey, grab them and take them on board and put them to work. So he was impressed in the British Navy. He got to Newfoundland and jumped ship and then found his way to Boston. And he got to Boston in 1775, which is a crucial date. And of course, having no love for the British at that point, he immediately joined the Continental Army. And he fought for the first 2.5 years of the Revolution in a lot of the major battles in New England, New York, New Jersey, the Battle of Trenton being the last. So she had a pretty good background, too, for patriotism in her family. FR then worked at local mills in the St. Louis area. And one of the jobs he had, the mill company he worked for, was running a leased mill in St. Anthony, Minnesota, which is forerunner to Minneapolis. So FR came up here to take over running the mill in September 1848, which was before Minnesota was a territory. There maybe was 5,000 people out here, maybe. So there was not a lot. And I think he went back and forth. I've seen conflicting dates of when he actually got to Minnesota, and it's been 1848, 1850, 1851, 1853. Well, the later dates aren't accurate, but I think he went back and forth because there wasn't much here. So that got him to Minnesota, and let me.
The first song you heard was New England or Nova Scotian, and it represented some of the first homesteads here were by Nova Scotians who came before any of the other people. The next great wave of people to arrive in Delano came on the railroads which Delano helped build, and they came pursuing what we might call the German dream of America. Somewhere to go where they could have land and not be oppressed by feudal lords, and they could have rights as people, which was very different than the situation there where they had a failed revolution in 1848. A failed revolution is called an uprising. So following that is when a lot of the German immigration began. This next piece is called Träumerei, or Dreams, and it's by Robert Schumann, who is one of the great German composers of the 1800s, who people would have listened to all the time. And this particular arrangement is for piano and cello.
Thank you. That was beautiful. All right. So we got FR to Minnesota, 1848. And he was working in St. Anthony at the government mill there, and it was a combination grain, and I believe they probably did some lumbering there too. And the mill was a leased mill. They worked primarily, I believe, for the troops at Fort Snelling, and provided a lot of their basic necessities, whether it was lumber or flour or whatever. Anyway, the lease expired in 1851, and FR was here, his family was here, he decided to stay here. And he was sort of smitten by Minnesota. He saw the potential that was here and realized that, somebody with some, knowledge, intuition, ambition could do pretty well here. So he, moved out to Stillwater, which those of you know was probably the largest town in Minnesota at that time in 1851. And he joined a firm called Taylor and Company, and the territorial government, and I brought a special guest here, Alexander Ramsey, and Alexander was the territorial governor at the time, and he, at his insistence, passed a law to create a territorial prison in Stillwater. And I don't think he'll tell us much about it, but essentially, the three big things that where you could make money in construction were the state capitol, the university, and the state prison. And these guys decided to go after the prison. And so FR drafted all of the plans for both the prison and the warden's house. And you can see those plans on display in the warden's house. It's a museum over in Stillwater. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. And after the prison was built and the house was built, again, this gentleman asked FR to be the first warden of the territorial prison in Stillwater. And so he began his term as warden. It was a 5-year term in 1853 of April. FR and Callista had 2 sons earlier. Unfortunately, neither one of them really survived more than a couple weeks. But while they were in Stillwater, they had a daughter, Carrie Jane, who was born, first baby born in the warden's house in 1856. Sadly, FR was not what you would call a good warden. That was not his calling. I don't think he ever really liked the job. I don't think he really ever put his effort into it. And it was just constantly burdened with all sorts of troubles. But I've got a couple of clippings from, one of them is from the 1856 edition of the Stillwater Messenger. So look at this house. FR and his family were living in it. And in 1856, October 28th, an attempt was made to break into the warden's house through the window. And Warden F.R. Delano had to fight off the burglar. So quoting from the paper, the scamp got nearly through the window when Mr. D discovered him, not having his revolver at hand. A few forcible remonstrances against such a procedure were made between the fellow's eyes. And when he backed out of the position with greater speed than he entered, in other words, translating it in the 21st century, FR punched him a few times, right smack in the nose, and the burglar flew back out the window. So that was, but he had other problems. One of the problems they had were the counties that would send prisoners, they wouldn't pay. Each county was expected to provide money to care for the prisoners, and a lot of them weren't doing it. So he would just let the prisoners go, and that created all sorts of problems for him with the legislature, needless to say. But, you know, no money, can't do it. One of the other things that was interesting, and that was the law at the time said that these prisoners would work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they were expected to do manual labor. So FR, being a pretty ambitious and entrepreneurial guy, brought in steam engines and set up a shop to make sashes, doors, windows, all sorts of wood products with the prisoners. So he brought in the equipment. They did the labor for zero, and he did quite well with that, except when he was his term as warden was up in April of 1858. And so another article from the prison history, the Minnesota Historical Society wrote an article about 60 plus years ago, and it talks about him. On the day Delano retired, Colonel William C. Johnson, sheriff of Washington County and former Marine Mills Justice of the Peace, presented his commission to the warden. Although his appointment had been signed by the Governor Medray the previous November, Johnson was undoubtedly restrained from taking over until the close of Delano's prison term. That was in August of 1858. When he did appear, Delano's deputy, McHale, who I think was a business partner in this prison venture, and who had been authorized to transact all the business of his partner, refused to surrender the prison keys. He demanded full payment for the machinery placed within the walls by Delano and Company before allowing anyone else to take charge. Johnson did not force his way in, and McHale acted as warden for another 5 months. What was interesting is I've seen an accounting of all this equipment, and it was probably over $8,000 worth of machinery there, which is quite a bit of money in 1858, I would think. So anyway, FR then, before I just wanted to talk about his knowledge of steam engines, because that's really crucial. You'll see in the table there's a couple articles from the October and November 1850 issue of Scientific American, and FR is talking about a new rotary steam engine by Stewart, and he obviously it was quite an advanced engine. He was very knowledgeable about it, as if you're interested in reading the article. But FR's knowledge of steam engines, starting back in the Boston and Worcester Railroad days, and then refined over the years, was quite advanced, and that's significant. Think of it as the internet of 1850. Steam engines were very, very big, and they were growing bigger all the time. Okay, if you do happen to go to the warden's house, you'll see a display of a lot of FR stuff. The walking stick that was on the intro slide is there. One of the other items is his psalm book. FR was a Congregationalist, which was the original Pilgrim religion. The Pilgrims brought with them. And the family stayed Congregationalists, and FR, of course, included, for over 250 years almost. And then the other item is a doll that belonged to Carrie Jane, FR's daughter, that was born in 1856. And the story on the doll is really interesting. Sadly, Carrie died in 1862 in Stillwater. And FR and Callista had a nurse or a nanny that took care of the little girl. And she was so distraught over the little girl's dying that they gave her the girl's doll. What was interesting is she later, last name was Davis, she later had a girl of her own, a little girl, closer to 1870, and she named her Carrie Jane. And the little girl kept the doll, and I remember her in the 1950s and even into the 60s when she was in her 90s. And one day she came over with an old suitcase, and she said, "I want you to have this. This belongs to your family." And so we had the doll for probably the last 55 years or so, and we donated it to the museum. But it's a really interesting piece of history. And there's some other stuff. The plans for the prison are there, pictures, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, after he was warden at the prison, his term was up 1858. He founded another company, Delano McCusick, and the purpose was lumbering. And there was a lot of lumbering in the Upper St. Croix going on at that point, and his job was to set it up and cut this high-grade lumber. Another family myth or legend was that FR owned a lot of property in Washington County, northern Washington County and beyond. I've not been able to find it, but I haven't dug that deep. But it all disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. So that's a myth or legend. He then stayed in Stillwater for a couple more years, and he became the engineer and surveyor. And then in 1862, he was selected as mayor of Stillwater. And he did that for only 1 year, and then he moved to St. Paul. We'll find out why. But before I leave Stillwater, I've got to show this. Again, this guy is key. You all know about the Dakota Uprising better than I do, but after the Dakota Uprising started, Ramsey selected FR to lead 4 companies of local militia and take them up the St. Croix, just in case the Ojibwe should want to come down into, Marine or Stillwater. Fortunately, they were posted up west of Pine City, or east of Pine City, between Pine City and the Wisconsin border. The Ojibwe were peaceful. In fact, they were sworn enemies of the Dakotas, so nothing ever happened for him, unlike his colleague, Colonel Sibley, who went up to Minnesota and found all sorts of trouble up that river. So this is his actual commission, signed by Ramsey, if you can barely see it, and that's over at the Warden's House Museum also. All right.
We've got a railroading song for you. Some of you might know it. There's lots of different versions of it. Like all folk music, there's infinite versions of this melody, but this one is John Henry, which is about the mechanization of the railroads and the individual labor driving the steel drill being replaced by the machine, which was called it was able to drive it quicker, the steam drill. The steam drill took the job of lots of people, but it helped push those railroads across the country.
Before you start, I'm going off script here, you can get nervous. Did anybody bring a sledgehammer and a railroad spike? Like if you did, feel free to hit it on 2 and 4, okay?
All right. When John Henry was just a little baby, sitting on his daddy's knee, he gave one long and lonesome cry, said a hammer be the death of me, said a hammer be the death of me.
Captain said to John Henry, gonna bring that steam drill around, gonna take that steam drill out on the job, gonna walk that steel on down, gonna walk that steel on down. John Henry told his captain, well, a man ain't nothing but a man, but the more that your steam drill takes me down, I'll die with the hammer in my hand. Yes, I'll die with the hammer in my hand.
Thought it was mighty fine, but John Henry drove the steel 15 feet, and the steam drill drove only 9, and the steam drill drove only 9.
John Henry kept hammering on that pump. There was lightning in his eye. He drove so hard that he broke his heart, and he laid down his hammer and died. Yes, he laid down his hammer and died.
They carried him off to the graveyard. They buried him in the sand, and people came from near and far to praise that steel driving man, to steel that steel driving man.
Yeah, very good. This next section, I mean, there's almost a full hour or two that we can talk about his railroading years. I'll try not to do that, believe me. And I've sort of summarized it quickly here in terms of the high points of his railroading years. And it really started in 1860 and went through the end of his life in 1887. But some of the key events that happened, obviously he joined the railroad. I think he commuted from Stillwater to St. Paul. And then in 1862, he was general superintendent, first of all, let me start there. And what he was responsible for were two things. One, the operations of the railroad, the moving of the freight, the passengers, and then obviously bringing in more freight, bringing in more passengers so the railroad can make money. And then obviously building out the railroad, taking it from its starting point in St. Paul, and then westward over to St. Anthony, northward up to St. Cloud and beyond, and then continuing on westward from St. Anthony out to the Minnesota border, and then up to, up as far as they thought initially, right out to the Red River, because there was a lot of commerce up and down the Red River to Winnipeg. And so if they could tie St. Paul in with the Red River, suddenly the Mississippi and the Red River became viable transportation options. They started out building the line to St. Anthony. That was easy, 10 miles, not a problem. They did that fairly quickly. However, during the Civil War, steel was in short supply. And so they couldn't build it, they weren't able to build as much of the line as they really wanted to. So they decided to start the St. Cloud line first. And in 1864, the line got to Elk River. 1866, you'll see it got to St. Cloud, and then it went a little bit beyond up to Sauk Rapids. Once they completed that line, and then he started the westward line from St. Anthony to the border. And he got to Wayzata in 1867, got to Crow River in 1868. And then when they got to Breckenridge, that's sort of like when he said, that's it, I've done it. He retired in early 1872. He was elected to the Minnesota legislature in 1874, served one term. And he was also the chaplain of the Minnesota legislature. And what do you think his political party was? I know they didn't have political parties in the legislature, but what do you think it was? Anybody? He had a brother who was a Republican, but it wasn't a Republican. It turned out in 1860, he was a alternate elector for Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat. And it was thought that he was a Democrat when he was in the Minnesota legislature, but I don't know if that really made a big deal or not. Anyway, after he retired, he then started up a number of small railroads and a lot of other business ventures. I won't go into all of them. I don't know all of them, actually. And then in 1880, he became right-of-way agent for the St. Paul Northern Pacific when those two roads merged. I'll go into some of the highlights here. All right. So this one I think you've posted it on one of the websites, but this is FR in the cab of the William Crooks, and many of you may remember the William Crooks. It was on display in the St. Paul Depot for a number of years. I believe it's in Duluth now, if I'm not mistaken. But this picture was, when it was in St. Paul, this picture was right next to the train. And this is FR in the cab with this fireman. And it was taken in Elk River in 1864 as they were building the line up to St. Cloud. Just some of the timetables are fun. You'll see his name prominently on both of them. And this, the one on the left is the timetable up to St. Cloud at that point, 1866. The one on the right, going back to your comment about Germans, it's in German. And this was from the Minnesota Stadtzeitung, and it from early 1867. And you can see the same, basically the same stops, but everything is in German. And I get a kick out of looking at some of the names on here, too. Obviously, St. Anthony, Mahnomen, I don't know where that was. Coon Creek, I didn't know there was a Coon Creek until I figured, must be Coon Rapids, right? There was an Itasca, then there was an Elk River. So somewhere between Anoka and Elk River, there was a town called Itasca. But anyway, most of the other ones are pretty similar in names from today's. This was kind of interesting. The photo on the left is found in a book by Heidi and Heidi on the Great Northern Railway. And there was a coach that was called the Delano Accommodation. And I think it was probably like second or third class. Inelegant but perfectly functional coaches. So they were nothing fancy. You see a wood stove in back, nice interior. So that was pretty much the coaches on the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad at that point. And then I put this one in because I thought it might have some local resonance. But in early January 26th, 1870, article from the Star and Tribune mentions that the town of Crow River is going to be renamed Delano. The bill went into the legislature. And it's being named in honor of F.R. Delano, superintendent of the road. So that was, what, 6 years before it was actually a town. But the stop, the railroad stop, was named Delano at that point. And then some more. Here's FR himself in the mid 1870s. This is where it gets kind of crazy because he did a lot of different things, and I won't go into all of them. But you'll see the timetable for just about the time that he retired, which was late 1871, early 1872. And you can see, obviously, the town of Delano figures prominently on it as a stop. And you could leave Delano at 6:45 in the morning and get to St. Paul at 9:05. That's pretty good. And depending on traffic on 94, it might still be about the same, right? Anyway, and then they also have, obviously, the train travel up to Sauk Rapids from St. Paul or St. Anthony. So he was into a lot of different things. One of the things, and again, it was a sort of a family myth or legend. I'd heard that he'd owned a lot of property around Sauk Rapids, and I never really knew why until I started researching him. And it turned out when he got the railroad up there, he thought that Sauk Rapids, because of its water power, it has a rapids, could be harnessed for cutting and polishing granite. And so he bought a lot of the surrounding land and put together a plan and a company called Sauk Rapid Waterworks to build essentially a dam, some locks, some chutes for the grand price of $200,000. It didn't happen, as far as I can tell. But what did happen was he had long been a business partner of Jim Hill, starting back in the 1860s, mid-60s. Jim Hill, as many of you may know, ran a steamship company, or steamboat, paddle boat, taking freight and passengers up and down the Mississippi to St. Paul. And at that point, that was about as far as they got. And then FR and Jim had a sort of an intermodal arrangement where they would take the freight off the ships and send them up the rail lines as far as the rail lines went. And then further on, they had ox carts or other carts to move it up in the northern Minnesota or western Minnesota. Anyway, in this period started sort of an effort to take control of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. This was Jim Hill and his business partners. Most of them were Canadian, or they had come to this country, and like Norman Kitson, and become business executives. So they formed a railroad called the Western Rail Line, and their whole intention was to build the line from Sauk Rapids to Brainerd. If they could do that, the Northern Pacific, which was coming out of Duluth, would give them 20% ownership that they had of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. And it's kind of complicated, I realize. And so FR founded this company with Hill on the board. And they proceeded in about 1876 to build the railroad from Sauk Rapids to Brainerd, or Brainerd to Sauk Rapids, I'm never sure which. And they did it by 1878. That plus the agreement by the Dutch bondholders to sell their shares allowed Hill and his investors to take over the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, which they renamed St. Paul and Manitoba. And FR stayed with them and worked with them as a right-of-way agent for quite a few years after that. And Jim Hill, as we all know, went on to great fame and fortune. He did a lot of other things. Because of his training at Amherst Academy, he was very widely read. I've pretty much disposed of all of his library now over the last 10 years. And he had books that spanned almost all subject areas. He was just an avid reader, both he and Callista. But again, this fellow, who founded the Minnesota Historical Society, asked FR to be on the board. And so he was in the 1870s. But also in the year of I believe it was 1879, he and a group of early pioneers in the state formed a committee to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the discovery of Hennepin County, or Minneapolis, or St. Anthony. And that was Father Hennepin, of course. And so they did that, and then they had a big celebration the next year, sponsored by the Minnesota Historical Society. And you'll see FR's name there at the bottom, but some other names might be familiar. John Sanborn, John Stevens were old pioneer names. But what's interesting is 100 years later, the Historical Society did it again, and they put both the original and then the 300th year anniversary together. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Callista. I'd mentioned some things about her. This woman was a saint. I mean, that's the only thing I can say. FR traveled a lot. He was always out on a business or building the line somewhere, and she basically ran the house and raised the children and did a lot of other things. Now, she had help, but she was basically kept it going. So this is a picture of Callista, I believe, in the mid-1870s. And this is his oldest son, who was born in 1860. After they lost the first three children, they were successful in the second two. And so this is Frank Cavender Delano. And then I don't have a picture of Lewis Howe Delano, but Frank Cavender happens to be my third great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather. And so she kept things moving while he was away, and ran the house and did really a phenomenal job, I think. All right.
I suppose this next one could go out to Callista Delano. It's by Chopin, who is a Polish composer. I've selected it because then the following wave of immigrants who came to Delano on the railroads, many of them came from Poland or the Czech areas. This sonata is very long, but back then people didn't have a lot of patience either. So it's the tradition to just play one movement of a sonata. It was called Salonmusik or Salonstücke. So this is a short, very sentimental 2-3 minute Polish piece. And we thought it's not so much sad as reflecting on a life well lived.
right. So sadly, FR passed away way too young. He was 63 and he died of typhoid pneumonia. And the obituaries at the time suggested that it happened kind of quickly, in the sense that it started out as a cold and then went downhill rapidly. Part of it is I think he was probably still working very, very hard. One of the things he was doing towards the end of his life in St. Paul was they made him president of the St. Paul Fire Commission. And he totally reorganized the fire department in St. Paul between about 1883 to the time he died. And they were very, very grateful for what he did. He hired a new chief, and he just restructured the whole department along with the help of the other commissioners. And at his death, he was surrounded by, obviously, his doctor, Dr. Briggs, and a few friends. And then his funeral was held 2 days later. You can see some of the funeral ornaments. The fire ladder was from the St. Paul Fire Department. It's a broken ladder signifying, job done. You really can't see it, but it says fire out on top of the flowers. And there's the cross, and and then of course his photograph in the middle. And then he was buried in Oakland Cemetery. A funny story, and again I think it's true. I've seen it printed in papers. On his deathbed, he asked one of his attendants to make sure that rather than his casket being put in a pine box, he wanted it to be in an oak box because, he said, Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul, and it's on Jackson, just north of the downtown area, is not going to be there forever. So they're going to have to disinter all the people that are there and move them to a new cemetery. And he said, I just don't want my bones scattered all over downtown St. Paul or wherever St. Paul. So put me in my casket in a nice oak box. And they complied with his wishes. And this is the house he lived in. He and Callista, they raised their family there. I don't have a picture of FR in the house, or Callista, but you can see this was taken in about the mid-1890s. The fellow on the bike is my grandfather. His mother, Daisy Delano, is sitting on the porch, and then Daisy's parents, Henry and Alice Vitt, are there. And that's a fascinating story, too. I won't go into it. But he came from Germany in the 1850s and was a saloon keeper in St. Paul, which you'll never go broke doing that at that point, and did fairly well with his saloon. And it was on Jackson, about 460 Jackson. It's not there anymore. But quite a guy. So that's where the funeral was held. Oh, my last story about this house. My dad grew up there in his teenage years. And then when he went off to service in the war, the family sold the house. And I remember it in the mid-'60s when they were building 94 and the 35E interchange. The house, unfortunately, it was right under the output of that interchange, 94 East. So I remember they had just a pile of rubble, and my dad went through and picked out a few pieces of woodwork and things that he remembered, and that was it. Well, let me read a couple things from his obituary to kind of give you what sort of a man he was. And this is from the St. Paul Globe, February 8th, 1887, honoring F.R. Delano. St. Paul Police Chief Black, who he hired, authorized all St. Paul firehouses to be draped in black for 30 days, lower the flag at half-mast. Superintendent of Alarms was ordered to toll the fire alarm gongs from 2 to 3 p.m. during the funeral service. The St. Paul mayor directed city flags to fly at half-mast, bells to be tolled for the late F.R. Delano. And then another obituary in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, February 7th, 1887, is, I think, very laudatory. At the risk of you know, everybody, they always say nice things about you after you died. There's a lot of nice things said. I just want to mention a few of them. So in 1860, FR came to St. Paul to become, under Edmund Rice, then president of the St. Paul Pacific Railroad, the general superintendent of the line. Railroading was a class of work to which he was adapted. The great scheme for connection of St. Paul with the West Coast had been formulated, and a man of his energy and will was needed to push the enterprise through. The state was in a wild, unsettled condition, and railroad construction was heroic. When in 1864, General George Becker became president, and some of you may know Becker County in Minnesota, that was named for George Becker, became president of the road, Mr. Delano remained in his old position and continued to do so until 1862. There were innumerable anecdotes afloat of his energy, persistency in conquering the wilds. He worked his I can't read my own handwriting here. He worked his men as no other men could. And yet, they displayed such acts of kindness and clarity towards them, or charity towards them, that to this day they have been loyal friends. It is said that the humblest day laborer on the road never went to him with a tale of injustice done or a dispute over pay, but what he took the matter in his own hand and settled it honorably to all concerned. Nothing pleased him more than to see fair play. That's pretty good. Another comment from General Becker. Another characteristic that FR had was that he never said go to his men, but it was always come on. Whether it was bucking snow, laying track, operating the passenger or freight departments, or inspecting the line, he was always in front. So, and just in going through some of the writing about him that came up, I mean, this is just some of the words that were used. Keen, shrewd, typical New Englander, which to us means a flinty Yankee. I mean, these are people who can make a buck where nobody else can make a buck because it was hard to do in New England. Brask, sharp manners, courteous, religious, a warm heart, resembled Lincoln, tall, spare, strong-muscled, constitution of iron. He was energetic, persistent, loyal, public-spirited, fearless, frank to an extreme, and that's a New England trait. Never hesitated to say what we believed to be right. He had a sense of humor, and he was a practical joker. So, and the last note in one of the obituaries said that FR left his wife Callista and sons Frank and Louis in comfortable circumstances. And I would say he did. Sadly, that's another story, but by the time my dad came along, there was no money. So I started from ground zero at that point. And so that's another mystery to be solved, is what happened in the comfortable circumstances. So that finishes my talk. And I don't know if you've seen this. This is in my parents' collection, but it's a pencil drawing of the old station here in Delano. And I thought that was a nice way to end. But yeah, let me know what your questions are. I don't know how much time we have, Deb, but yes, sir.
I was wondering if he ever visited Wright County after that, or any other times, and then whether or not he even had an impression of the community or the town.
Yeah, good question. Did he ever visit Wright County or Delano, and what was his impression? He would have come through here quite a bit. Because obviously he was building the line out to Breckenridge, and then later on he was right-of-way agent up in the Dakotas. He built the Castleton line, and I think I'd mentioned to John perhaps that there was a town named Delano in North Dakota, briefly. A year later it was changed to Hunter, North Dakota, and there's no road through it now. But but I don't know what his impression was. I can tell you, just my own impression is, I think he and Callista would have been very, very proud for the town that is here now, no question about it. The sense of community that I see. I've been at the 4th of July parade, which was nothing short of amazing, really. I think would have glowed his heart nicely. But I don't know if I've never read that he spent time here, that he talked to anybody. you'll see it mentioned that the town was named after him, but nothing that says, other than passing through. That was it. Well, that is in Oakland Cemetery, St. Paul. It's about, maybe a mile or so north of the downtown on Jackson. And he's buried there in his oak box, and along with his wife, his sons, daughter-in-laws, and grandsons, his grandson and his wife's. So there are 3 generations there. And there are not going to be 4, and there are not going to be 5. So but 3 is there. In fact, there's a couple open slots. Another question, Lisa. Yes, sir. It was, the legislature passed it in 1870, early 1870s. Oh yeah, he knew it. Oh sure, he knew it, and he knew it for 17 years afterwards. Yeah, and then it became an official town. What was it? 1876, I think I heard. Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah, a couple things. And without going into great detail, the state had purchased a lot of land, whether purchased or took it over. You can argue whatever it was, from St. Anthony all the way up there, and gave the railroad exclusive use to build the road, and then also to build towns and to build, sell off pieces of the land for farming. So when they platted these towns, and they did them every 10 miles, 8 miles or so, they would create the station, they would plat the town, and then they had to name the town. And most of the towns around here, a lot of them, are named after railroad executives. So Delano, Litchfield, Wilmer, Breckenridge, Moorhead, Minot, Billings are all railroad towns that were named after railroad executives. And the earlier question somebody asked me is, did FR populate these towns? And the answer is yes and no. He was responsible for, selecting the location of the town because they needed to stop for commerce, they needed to stop for water, and they also needed to stop for wood to fire the boilers on the engines. So he would plat the town, but Minnesota had a very efficient method of recruiting new immigrants to come to Minnesota, and they had offices in New York, I believe Chicago, and maybe Montreal. And they would, as these people would come off the boat, they'd say, we have a town, and the boat came in from Gdansk maybe, or Bremen or Hamburg, and they would say, yeah, we need farmers, we need retail workers, we need blacksmiths, whatever. And they'd say, sure. And off they came. In fact, one of the books I donated to the Washington County Museum and the Warden's House was a book that basically sold Minnesota. It's from the mid-1850s, and it sold how wonderful this place was, and land of opportunity. And it was basically to get people from the East Coast to move out here. But once once a group came in from Germany or Poland or Sweden, they wrote back what a wonderful place it was, and guess what? More came. No more? All right. Oh, way back. Well, his 2 older brothers came west with him, and sadly I've lost touch. I don't know what happened. They stayed in, I'm guessing, the St. Louis area and had families and started their family. His one brother, Charles, that stayed in the east, had family, and they stayed around, but again, lost touch with those. So it was just his one older brother from his father's second marriage. From the first marriage, there were 6, kids. I think 4 of them made it to adulthood, and they all stayed east, of course. And I'm sure I've run into some of them, and I wouldn't even know I'm related. Deb?
Can you talk a little bit about Delano kindred?
Delano kindred. Well, like a lot of old New England families, we organize ourselves into kindred societies. So there's like the Alden kindred or the Standish kindred. And Delanos are considered first comers in the Plymouth area. And so the Delanos have a kindred society that it's worldwide, actually. And we have about 250 members. We've had more. And we meet once a year somewhere. We don't have a house like the Aldens do or some of the other kindreds, so we don't necessarily come back to the same place every year. We go wherever there's a Delano story or a Delano history that is interesting. And a lot of people use it as just a chance to get away. It's a vacation, really, for them. And they've been involved for 30 years now in this. And yeah, and should I say something? We're thinking of coming here next year. So call it Delano's Coming to Delano. And it'll probably be next September. We haven't set a firm date yet, but that's our goal. And we get anywhere from, I would say 40 to 80 people attending the annual meeting. And we have speakers, we have a business meeting, and then people just go and walk around and soak up whatever the Delano sites are. We had a meeting in Stillwater 11 years ago, and that was interesting. So we found out about FR's early life then. But we go wherever. We went to Fairhaven, where FDR's ancestors, Fairhaven, Massachusetts, were, and learned that. Or we've been to Hyde Park, and we've been to all over the country, the Carolinas, the West Coast, Vermont, Maine, anywhere there's a Delano presence, so to speak. Sure.
Did your ancestry go out to California at all?
Yes.
Delano, California?
Yes. It was named for Columbus Delano, who was in the cabinet for Ulysses S. Grant. And so I don't know if he was ever in Delano, California, but it was Columbus Delano.
Were you related to them?
Oh, yeah. We all come from the one person. So, yeah, it could be 6th or 7th cousin or whatever, but yeah, we're all sort of related there. And what's even kind of crazy is I've been exploring the European connection, and I found Delano's in Holland that never came here. and that's kind of interesting, too. And we're related. And DNA is a wonderful thing because you can match it up, and you find out that you really are who you think you are. On the Fortune. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's generally thought that Philip Delano was on the Speedwell. And if you know your Pilgrim history, there were 2 ships that the separatists planned to bring to the New World. One was the Speedwell, which they owned, and then another, the Mayflower, which they chartered. Speedwell was going to stay here. Mayflower was going to go back. What happened was somebody had overmasted the Speedwell, so that when they put it under full sail, it started leaking, and the water was running through the boards on the sides. And they tried twice to leave, and they just couldn't do it, so they turned around. And Philip then went back to Leiden and spent the winter there and came back the following year. If any of you have read Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Mayflower, he goes into it in great detail there. And you'll see Philippe mentioned, along with his son, my 6th great-grandfather, Jonathan Delano, was mentioned in there, along with FR, or FDR, I should say. But he goes into much more depth. And there's some thinking that the captain of the Speedwell really didn't want to go to the New World, and therefore he overmasted the ship and knowing it would leak. But I can imagine Philip, sitting there bailing like mad, and trying to keep the ship afloat, and finally saying that's it. So they took a few of the passengers, about 12, off of the Speedwell, put them on the Mayflower, the rest of them, and there probably were about maybe 40 went back to Leiden or stayed in England and waited the following year. So. Great. Well, thank you. It's been a privilege.
We have one more closer, mid-20th century American tune, All of Me by Seymour and Marks. And it's because Delano gave all of himself for helping build up a community. So here goes All of Me. All of me, why not take all of me? Can't you see, I'm no good without you. Take my lips, I want to lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them. Your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you? You took the part that once was my heart, so why not take all of me?
I just want to thank everybody for coming. There are still some goodies here if you want to take them for the road, and have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.